Welcome back to How to Fix Democracy, the show about the current state of democracy around the world. Our fourth season of How to Fix Democracy is focused on democracy in America. And in the first show in the new season, we talked about Alexis de Tocqueville and his ideas about why America was a revolutionary society because of its democracy, how democracy defined America, and America was defined by democracy itself, and perhaps indeed how democracy was defined in the 19th century, at least by this new form of democracy in America. I've got two guests on my show today, very contemporary guests. They're not Tocqueville experts, although I know they're both very familiar with his work. And I want to fast forward and imagine that Alexis de Tocqueville, by some miracle, some theological or technological miracle, was able to come back to America in 2022. And I wonder what he would make of democracy in America. My two guests are Pete Wehner and Jonathan Rauch. They're both distinguished conservatives. I'm not sure if they're comfortable with that term. They might correct me if they don't think of themselves as conservative.
I'll take distinguished, Andrew.
Okay, I'll take out the distinguished. They're both very average conservatives.
Yes.
And they're distinguished, if that's the right word, by a joint piece they wrote in the New York Times a few months ago about the current disrepair of democracy in America, particularly within the Republican Party. So, Pete Wehner, let me start with you. If our old friend de Tocqueville did reappear by some miracle, what do you think he would make of the current state of democracy in America?
Yeah, it's good to be with you, Andrew and John. It's a good question. I mean, I imagine that he wouldn't be shocked in the sense that Tocqueville understood the challenges of democracy. And this is not a system of government that is natural to human beings. And throughout most of human history, democracy has not been the norm. It's been a liberalism. So he was certainly aware of that. I do think that he would be discouraged, certainly if he had the lens of American history, particularly over the last 50 or so years. And when it felt like in a lot of important respects, America was, I think, getting stronger, not weaker. And faith in democracy itself was almost a given. It was granted within America. I think today something else something has changed, and that is that we are seeing a tremendous loss of faith in democracy itself. I think you're seeing both on the left and particularly on the right, illiberal movements rise up, and even pockets of intellectuals, Catholic integralists and others, who believe that liberalism, classical liberalism, has failed, and therefore it has to be overturned. And the last thing that I'll say before turning it over to John is that I think having had 4 years of the Trump presidency and then a couple of years bracketing that has done tremendous damage as well, because particularly at the tail end of the Trump presidency, and since he left, because now we have the person who was previous president, still the leader of the Republican Party, engaging in what's essentially a full-out, all-out assault on democracy itself and corroding in extraordinary ways, very alarming ways, faith in democracy and elections itself. So I think we're in a precarious situation. I don't think we're at the edge of a cliff. We're not 2 minutes to midnight, whatever metaphor you wanted to use. But I do think that we're in a place that's more difficult, more challenging than we have in quite a long time, and that these are fundamental challenges, not just passing ones.
Jonathan Rauch. John, Pete talked about a crisis of faith. That's a rather conservative trope. Is it a crisis of faith in democracy in the America of 2022, or is it just a crisis in one particular party?
Well, it's primarily a crisis of one particular party. It grows out of a crisis of faith, though it's not a crisis of faith that just happened accidentally. We've been seeing, really since the George Wallace movement of the late 1960s, a substantial group of Americans, roughly 20 to 25% by my back of the envelope count then and now, who were fundamentally driven by a kind of grievance-oriented populism. They didn't really have a policy agenda. They just felt unvoiced. They were very unhappy about elites. They felt deeply aggrieved. They were motivated by some instincts like nationalism, for example, in its extreme format, dislike of the other, and they were not as committed to the core values of democracy as traditional other sections of the American public were. They have been there for 50 years, but what's new is their consolidation in the Republican Party and their followership of Donald Trump and now the MAGA movement. And yeah, that means that it's kind of what Pete and I were getting at in our recent New York Times op-ed piece. We are seeing a crisis that, although it has deep roots, is, I think, heavily concentrated in the Republican Party.
Pete, you're a man of faith. Is a belief in democracy a form of faith?
Yeah, I think to some extent it is, but I think it's a form of faith that's based on a rational assessment of things, and that there's empirical evidence on behalf of democracy. That is, I think the democratic experiment has shown to be the best political system when it comes to advancing human flourishing and human dignity. But look, democracy is a tricky thing, and the founders understood democracy as a tricky thing, and so did Lincoln, particularly the early Lincoln, well, later one too. I mean, he dealt with the Civil War, but the early Lincoln, who gave a speech, Young Men's Lyceum speech, where he warned about mob violence. And the concern of the founders, of course, particularly Madison, but many others, was that democracy, unmitigated democracy, direct democracy, was a huge challenge, because the concern was that it would tap into the passions of the people, and those passions can overwhelm reason at any given moment. That's the reason that we set up the system of government America has. Checks and balances, separation of powers. That's a source of frustration to a lot of Americans. It's a source of frustration to people overseas who think that our system is too clumsy and not efficient enough. But the core insight that I think the founders had, which I think has been validated in recent years, particularly given the Trump presidency, was that you have to set up a system of government that is a check on these passions. So democracy takes different forms. I think the way to think about it, my own opinion, is that a Republican form of government is better than democracy. That's what we've got. I think it's more accurately linked to what human nature is like. So there is such a thing as a democratic faith, but I do think it's a democratic faith grounded in empirical evidence and also an assessment of human anthropology.
John, is there a golden period of American democracy that we can look back on and think that's when American democracy generally worked?
There's no perfect period. For all the problems that we have now, I'm a American homosexual born in 1960. I was alive when the Southern United States was really not a democracy in a meaningful sense, at least not a fully inclusive democracy. I was alive when people like me, although not necessarily second-class citizens at the polls, were not allowed to work in government, for example, to serve in the military. Of course, we couldn't get married. So no, I don't think there's a golden age. I do think there's a succession of challenges. What's especially worrisome about the challenge right now, though, is that it's the first time in living memory, or maybe I think ever, since that the functional challenge to crucial democratic norms, like accepting the results of election and the peaceful transfer of power, respecting the rule of law, not using your Justice Department to try to stymie or punish your enemies. It's the first time we've seen those things concentrated, embodied, and institutionalized in one of our two major political parties. And that is a different kind of problem than if it's just kind of floating around out there.
Pete, you've been a very vocal and articulate critic of what's happening, or what's been happening within the Republican Party. Your essays, particularly I think in the Atlantic on Trump, are enormously influential. What has happened in the Republican Party? You're a lifelong Republican. You worked in both Bush administrations and in the Reagan administration. So you've seen this from the inside.
Yeah, it's an important question, and it's a somewhat puzzling question. I really broke with the Republican Party once Trump came along, but you're right, I have been a lifelong Republican. What explains these pathologies? I'd say the simplified version, because it's a very deep question, we could probably talk for hours or days on it, is that there were these currents, these deeper undercurrents that were existing, and that often exists in political parties, these sort of fringe movements. And the Republican Party, what were those elements? What were those currents? What were they consisting of? I think some of it were this deep sense of grievances and resentments, which John had alluded to. It was a feeling that the country was moving away from the America that a lot of these people knew, had grown up with, idealized. Some of it was on social issues, but it had to do with other areas as well. There was a feeling that a lot of Republicans and conservatives were looked down with condescension and a patronizing attitude of the elite culture. So I think that was at play. There was a move, I would say, that was particularly pronounced in the Republican Party, not exclusively, but particularly of a kind of theatrical politics. We began to move away from a serious intellectual attachment in politics to the more theatrical side. You know, if you go back to 1981, the New York Times, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who's a prominent Democrat, wrote a column in the Times, and he said, of a sudden, the GOP has become a party of ideas. And I was really formed in the 80s as a conservative. And at that time, there were really serious figures, Irving Kristol and serious books, James Q. Wilson, Richard John Newhouse, critiques of the judiciary, welfare, on and on. And there was a kind of pride, I think, a pride rooted in reality about the intellectual rigor of conservatism that began to be lost, and then it accelerated. Then you had figures like Newt Gingrich, who I think was a much larger figure than most people are aware of in the Republican psyche and ultimately in America. He came in with a disposition, a kind of Trump-like disposition, viewing politics as warfare. And when he won and became speaker in 95 with the huge election in 94, I think that changed the Republican Party in a lot of ways. So you had these currents going on, including within the evangelical Christian movement, which I'm quite familiar with as a person of Christian faith. Then on top of that, you had Donald Trump, who tapped into that in an extraordinary way. And so he took those existing sentiments and dispositions and sort of blew the doors off. He accelerated them, he amplified them. And in the past, when these elements have existed, you had leaders, whether it was Reagan or George H.W. Bush or George W. Bush or John McCain, who kept them on the periphery, or basically said, you know, there's a kind of no-fly zone in terms of what you can and can't get away with. That was obviously not only gone with Trump, but he invited it, he celebrated it. And that, I think, took us from a serious situation to an extremely alarming one.
Pete, what made or makes you a Republican?
Well, what made me a Republican was a certain view, I would say, of a conservative view of human nature. There are attributes that are associated with conservatism that you don't see today. I should say right here, I would say it's important to say that I don't think the Republican Party is a conservative party. I think it's a ethnic nationalist party. I think it's a populist party. But there is a view, a kind of Burkean view of conservatism, which is, many other champions over many decades, of a kind of view toward moderation, compromise, a sort of conservative sensibility, which I've always associated with, going back to, as I was saying earlier, about the founders and the dangers of the passions. But then there are views of when I was a young man, the view of civil society, the importance of civil society to a healthy society, an attitude toward America's role in the world. I would say that when I was growing up, the left had a more negative view of America than I felt. I think America has obviously made mistakes, but overall it's been a force for good. A view of government, limited government, reforms on a whole range of issues. I was a champion of welfare reform in the 1990s, and I think the record's pretty clear that those reforms really helped human lives, and it was an insight into human nature that was reflected well. Education reform and so forth. So some of it was policy, some of it was disposition, some of it was attitude, and I'm sure some of it was just my own life story. My parents were, although they were not deeply involved in politics, they were conservative leaning. So those were all of my the factors, or those were some of the factors that shaped me. And when I saw Trump, and I saw what Trump, I believed he was doing, not just to the country, but to the conservative movement, the Republican Party, I was just horrified. I was horrified immediately. And I just thought, I got to get off this train. And I was surprised that that more people didn't get off.
The smart ones got off. John, what made or again makes you a Republican in a classical traditional sense?
Well, I would first, on the comment you just made, the smart ones got off. I wish that were true. I don't see any
There are still smart
correlation.
ones left on board, John?
I'm sorry?
There are still smart people left on board?
Absolutely. That's been the great surprise and shock, really, and disappointment to me. There's no correlation that I can see. Pete will correct me, but no correlation between education or intelligence or knowledgeableness about policy and support for Trump. I would have thought there would be, but I've been surprised again and again by the number of brilliant and distinguished people, and we can both name some, and one of them happens to be Pete Wehner's mentor, who have gone over to the Trump and MAGA movement. And if you ask me why, I don't understand it, but I can tell you that intelligence and analytical skill is no safeguard at all.
I think John is right. Just to pause on that for a moment, there's a huge distinction between intelligence and wisdom and discernment. And so, and in fact, I think John has helped teach me this through his wonderful book, The Constitution, Knowledge, A Defense of Truth, which is often intelligent people are the most dangerous of all because of the fact of their intelligence. They can come up with some pretty clever and creative ways to justify positions that are ultimately not justifiable.
That's a pretty conservative. That's a sort of a classically Burkean argument, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes. So I think a lot of this has to do with discernment, judgment, and disposition, and temperament. So I think I would argue the wise people got off, but not necessarily all the intelligent people got off.
Well, John, you almost got out of asking that question about what makes you a Republican, but I'm back on that one. What
well,
drew you to a party? I mean, you noted earlier that you were born in 1960, that you are a homosexual. I'm guessing that the party, when you were growing up, wasn't particularly friendly to homosexuality, was it?
That is a very good guess, Andrew. I come to this from a very different road than Pete. I'm not a person of faith. Of course, I am gay. And I have never been a partisan person. I have never been a member of either party. I came up as a journalist in the 80s when, Washington Post reporters were discouraged from even voting. I believed, as Christopher Hitchens used to say, partisanship makes you stupid. And I jealously guarded my independence from any partisan affiliation. I tried even to police myself against becoming partisan. The place where I'm now is the most uncomfortable place politically I've ever been, because I am now a partisan in the sense of believing that the Republican Party is a threat to the future of liberal democracy, and that requires my positive support for the Democratic Party, not because I agree with them more necessarily on taxes or regulation or trade or a lot of other things, but because these two parties have become different kinds of things. One, the Democrats are still a traditional coalition party that are built around policy interests. The other, the Republicans, have been largely taken over by what political scientists call an anti-system movement. people who are not fundamentally committed to the values of liberal democracy. So I'm in a very uncomfortable spot, but I've never been a capital R
I'm guessing,
Republican.
John, you like it. You're the kind of guy who likes to be in uncomfortable spots. It brings the best out of you. You never want to be comfortable, right?
Well, I rarely have been. I'll put it that way.
Pete, what is it about principled conservatives like you that make you such effective critics of men like Donald Trump? I've always thought that your critique, perhaps David Frum, I mean, I know John may not be a conventional Republican, but he's certainly more conservative than the typical Democrat. What is it about traditional conservatives that make them such effective critics of the current tendency within the Republican Party?
Well, thanks. It's generous of you. I'd say several things. One is I think those of us who are part of the Republican Party understand it. I mean, that always it always helps. So you're conversant in it, and I've had countless conversations with friends of mine, people that I've still maintained friendships. Sometimes it's been a bit strained, but it's been very important to me to try not to allow the politics of this moment, as serious as they are, to break up relationships. Sometimes it's harder, sometimes it's easier. But in any event, I've had a lot of conversations with people. And honestly, I listen a lot. I ask people, you tell me what it is that you see in him, or tell me what you think I'm missing. And I try and give people the room to do it. I try not always to debate them, but just to hear where they're coming from. So that helps, quite honestly, just to be able to articulate the view that they're coming from. Second is, I think that there is some understanding related to that of what it is about Trump that would have appealed to them. I do think it would be fair to say that I understood the threat of Trump earlier than most people. The first warning shot that I fired, well, I actually did a piece in 2011 in the Wall Street Journal called The GOP and the Birther Trap, where I said, don't play footsie with a guy like this. He's trouble. And then when he was running for president, 3 weeks after he got into the race, so he got in June, and it was in July of 2015 in the New York Times, I wrote a piece called President Donald Trump, ? Just say no. And I felt like I had some understanding of his appeal, because it turned out there were people at the Times, not my editor, who was a close friend, but others who didn't want to publish the piece because they thought, this is silly. Why on earth would we publish a piece on a guy who's going to be ephemeral, who's going to pass away? The other thing I would say, Andrew, that I think has helped me doesn't have to do with political philosophy or political theory, conservatism. It has to do with human psychology. I had a sense early on, I had a conversation with a pretty noted journalist in the spring of 2016. And I had known him through my work in the Bush administration. And he was clearly calling other Republicans, asking, how should I think about and cover Trump? And here's the short version of the conversation I had with him. I said, the most important thing you can do is to consult psychiatrists and psychologists, because the single most important thing to understand about Donald Trump is his disordered personality. That was the phrase I was using at that time. And I said, if you don't understand that, you're not going to understand the most important things about him. And that then led to a conversation about the Goldwater rule, which is a rule that was adapted for psychiatrists after the 1964 election, because a lot of psychiatrists who didn't like Goldwater put forward public statements saying he was mentally unwell, would get us in a nuclear war. People felt like that was a violation of ethics. So they said, you can't do that anymore. If you're not analyzing a person, you shouldn't make judgments about their psychological state. And my response to this journalist was, as a general matter, I think that rule is relevant, but I think this is the exception of the case. So I had very early on a sense that this man was psychologically deeply unwell, and that he would pull other people into that world and ratify certain things that they never would have in a different reality have ever validated or ratified themselves. And so that I wouldn't say is conservatism or liberalism. It was just a sense, for whatever reason, that we were dealing with something that was the real exception in American history. And to me, it still is the Rosetta Stone for understanding Donald Trump.
Pete's presenting perhaps a vision of the Republican Party very much built around a singular man who he says is psychotic. But it goes beyond just one man, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think Pete and I agree on that now, that what began with one man has now spread far beyond one man. And in fact, the followers of that man have become a movement that's largely, though not entirely, independent of that man. Of course, this was a shock for all of us. What normally happens in a constitutional democracy is if the leader loses an election, then that's a source of shame and correction for the party. And that person is basically dispatched to the wilderness, and the party moves on and tries something else. And that's what I thought was likely to happen if Donald Trump lost to Joe Biden. Of course, obviously, something very different happened, and that's the Stop the Steal movement, the most audacious and successful political disinformation campaign that's ever been run against America by anyone, foreign or domestic. The commitment of the Republican Party to the proposition that if it loses, the election is rigged, at least a large share of the Republican Party. And the fact now that the MAGA movement is in some ways willing to go further than Donald Trump himself. So we're dealing, I think, now with a kind of, if the metaphor would be cancer, it starts in one place, but then it metastasizes to others.
If I could just say for 30 seconds, because I agree with everything that John said. I think what was not understood sufficiently, and I think what's been shown, Andrew, is the moral deformation that happens when you embrace the kind of lies and conspiracy theories and politics that Donald Trump did. I know people, I have these conversations as the election we're coming up to the 2020 election and shortly after. And the one phrase that was used, and it applies to different conversation I had with people, is that there would be a snapback, that this Donald Trump was a parenthesis, an ugly parenthesis. This is from people
like McCarthy.
Yeah, and these are people who would privately criticize Trump but not publicly do it for a whole series of reasons. But they thought, okay, he's been defeated. Now we're going to go back to the old liberal, conservative, Republican, Democratic parties. And what they didn't understand, they would have if they had their druthers. And they tried, right? We saw that right after January 6th for a couple of hours, 48 hours or so. What they didn't sufficiently understand was the radicalizing effect on the base of the party. And that happens when there is a moral deformation when you engage in this stuff. So they created this monster, this Frankenstein, and then they figured out, geez, there's not an off switch to it. That's what we're seeing now.
John, you mentioned sexual identity earlier in the Republican Party. What about the issue of race? We've had a number of shows in the past on the racial and racist politics in America with a lot of distinguished guests, including Carol Anderson. How important do you think the politics of race is in the Trumpian rejection of democracy?
It's a complicated question, and one that I'm not a leading expert on. There's, as you can imagine, there's been a ton of research in political science.
But it's beyond
research to nail this down.
You must have it on this.
So my general sense is that part of what's motivating Trump has to do with race, of course. But it's not old-fashioned Southern style anti-N-word racism. It's not segregationism. It's more of a sense of nostalgia among white working class Americans that the country no longer belongs to them, that they're no longer at the heart of their story. One of the interesting things that's been found over the last few years is that if you talk to Trump voters about African Americans, their feelings toward African Americans actually improved under Trump. They became warmer. But what also happened is that those same white Trump voters increasingly identified themselves as a white group, as a minority, and their warmth toward whites as a self-conscious group also grew. So what you saw was the rise of a kind of white consciousness identity politics movement. And of course, you then saw that, for example, in front of the Capitol. on January 6th with groups like the Oath Keepers. So this is something a little new and different. It's the rise of a kind of European-style white nationalism. It doesn't want to go back to a world where blacks and whites can't share a drinking fountain, but it does want a world where whites have identity group status and are spoken for by someone like Donald Trump.
Pete, I understand and respect the fact that you're a Burkean conservative, but there are other forms of conservatism. The one that Jon talked about, a racial foundation in terms of defining oneself and the world. Why can't you have a white working class democratic political party in America? Why is that anti-democratic? Why is that a threat to the republic?
Well, I don't think a white working class party or group is per se a threat to the republic at all. I think a lot of it just depends on how the stuff manifests itself. How is it represented? How is it understood? I wanted to mention one anecdote which I thought was revealing, also that bears on this question, because it's a serious one, and I agreed with Jon's critique, and I thought he did a very nice job, subtle job, of explaining the issue of race in the Republican Party. But this is an anecdote which I do think says something. I have a friend who's a journalist who had a breakfast with a person at that time. This was, I think it was in 2018. It was right around then. This person was in the Senate, and a friend of mine asked the senator to explain the rise of Trump in his state, particularly because remember that in 2016 you had pretty much any flavor of ice cream that you wanted as a Republican. If you were a libertarian, if you were a social conservative, if you were a sort of Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio reform conservative. It was a field of 16 people. It was pretty impressive. And so the obvious question was, why would Donald Trump, who had no institutional affiliation with the Republican Party, in many ways been liberal for many years, why would he have wiped everybody out and won so easily? And this person said it wasn't for public attribution, said that when Obama became president, that had a huge backlash effect in his state. And this is a person who had no reason to, he wasn't saying this publicly, he wasn't trying to portray himself as, as a liberal. He had a lifelong attachment, obviously, to the Republican Party. So I think some of those elements existed. And again, part of political leadership, or not part of political leadership, is to keep those elements on the fringe. One other point, which is a figure that I just want to mention very briefly, who I think is extremely consequential in understanding the rise of what's happened in the Republican Party and more broadly on the American right, and therefore affecting American democracy, is Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan was a huge figure. If you go back and watch what happened to him, his own evolution, right, from being a pro-Reagan guy to his sort of paleo-conservative roots, and the agenda of isolationism, nativism, and protectionism. His agenda that he articulated when he challenged George H.W. Bush in 1992 was basically embraced by Donald Trump. Now, Buchanan was a much more serious figure, much more well-read, much more of an intellectual than Donald Trump. But those impulses were there. And Buchanan tapped into them, but they were tamped down. But there was a real rise. Remember that Buchanan beat George H.W. Bush in New Hampshire, and and he was a serious threat to Bush at that time. So those elements again have existed for a while, and sometimes you reach kind of inflection points at various times in the life of a country or a life of a movement.
Jon, your piece you wrote with Pete was very hard-hitting, got a huge response in the New York Times, and was quite depressing in the sense that whilst you argue that the Republican Party is in crisis, you don't really let the Democrats off the hook, and you suggest that there are forces within the Democratic Party which are also deeply anti-democratic. Perhaps you might talk about those.
Well, this is the mission that Pete and I set out to do again and
our
again.
lives, yeah?
Yeah, again and again. We were hearing from conservatives who we respected that they were deeply dismayed by the Trump MAGA phenomenon, but that it was still necessary to, if not out and out support Trump and MAGA, then at least stay in that camp because the left was so much more dangerous. And what they're worried about has, Pete and I believe, powerful elements of truth in it, which is a cultural movement, I think more than it is a political movement, though some of both, which has come out of academia in the last 30, 40 years, which disputes the very idea of truth, for example, replaces it with the notion that it's power all the way down, that takes an obsessive view of race and class in America, structures it in kind of a neo-Marxist way so that we need a kind of permanent revolution in which oppressed, marginalized minorities are in a kind of ongoing, constant form of social change. There's anti-Americanism involved. And when I look around, I'm not as frightened as some of my more conservative friends, but I can't deny that these and other pretty radical left-wing concepts are now very widespread in the academy. Now they're increasingly widespread in newsrooms and workplaces. So what Pete and I set out to do was acknowledge that, and that what we have now in America is a different kind of conflict or conversation than we used to. It's not left against right. It's liberal versus illiberal. It's an illiberal left plus an illiberal right who actually help prop each other up by driving people into each other's arms, versus those of us who still believe in Republican-style democracy and liberal values. But Pete and I also did want to say to conservatives, look, we recognize how dangerous the left is, but right now, the bigger problem is the Trumpian right, because it's got control of a political party and it's bent on taking the next election. If it can't win it outright, it's going to try to do it the wrong way.
Pete, as someone who lived through the Trumpian transformation of the Republican Party, what advice would you give to traditional liberals within the Democratic Party about fighting the forces of intolerance?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the first thing I would say is don't become like the people that you oppose. It's just very easy in politics when you think the stakes are really high to begin to embrace the methods that you at one time abhorred. Beyond that, I would say, if I were counseling liberals, to be alert to the dangers and the extremes on your own side, which John has mentioned. I mean, to be very specific on a couple of issues that I think are real sticks of dynamite for the liberal movement and the Democratic Party, which would be law enforcement and police, and also education. The defund the police effort in 2000 was not only wrong, I think, on the merits and dangerous. I think it was one of the stupidest political slogans that's probably been around in this decade or this century. Be alert to what is viewed, and I think in some respects justifiably viewed, as an aggressive cultural assault, and positioning your party as sort of enemies of parents in the education struggle is not a winner as well. But beyond those, which are sort of tactical but not unimportant, it would be, I think, maybe this is just my own disposition here, which is to speak in more positive terms about the blessings of liberty and liberalism, since I do think that the central struggle right now in American politics is between liberalism and illiberalism, and classically understood. And I think there's a kind of defensiveness that's been evident for too many years, where people have forgotten why liberalism and pluralism are good in and of themselves and actually lead to greater human understanding and greater human flourishing. And I think there needs to be a kind of deepening faith. It's been an interesting reaction, I would say, which is what's happened in terms of Russia and Ukraine, seeing the Ukrainians stand up seems to have had a kind of electrifying effect, not just in this country, but around the world, as if it's put in sharp relief for a lot of people why liberalism actually is a good system of government and is worth defending and promoting, which just goes to show that life is just very, very complicated. It's a, as John Adams said, it's a theater of vicissitudes. You just never know when certain individuals, a comic, a Ukrainian comic who becomes president, turns out to be a kind of Churchillian figure in his own country and inspires not only them, but other people. That we'll see how this plays out. I don't want to put all the eggs in that basket, but my only point is that life is difficult to anticipate. There are all sorts of trajectories it takes. Sometimes it's worse than you think, sometimes it's better. And that's why as individuals, you can't, you just have to be faithful. You can't make success the standard of your actions or your words or your stand.
And I think that that's a healthily anti-utilitarian conservative argument. We, just to remind viewers, we are talking on March the 7th, 2022. You will see this interview in a couple of weeks, so who knows what will have happened on the Ukrainian front by then. John, we started this conversation. We need to wrap up. It's been a wonderfully rich conversation. We started talking about, or me talking about, bringing Alexis de Tocqueville back to life. He certainly must be turning in his grave if he hears about both the crisis of democracy, particularly on the right, but on the left as well. I wonder, thinking about this, whether the parties should even matter anymore. I mean, for those of us who are just disgusted with what's happening, certainly in the Republican Party, but perhaps also on the left as well, why not just do de Tocqueville and participate in your local community, join your local school board, get involved with your local dog catching community? Wasn't that the essence of American democracy that de Tocqueville wrote about, that he admired so much when he visited the country in the first part of the 19th century?
Well, it was, of course, but parties are, not just in America, throughout the world, the fundamental organizing units of democracy. You don't actually see democracies without parties. Even computer simulations of democracies, clusters will form that look a lot like parties. You've got to have these organizations that can build coalitions, work out disagreements internally, and then take those disagreements into politics in an organized way. You've got to have structures that can keep sociopaths out of politics. And now we understand how very important it is that happened. Both of the parties did that very successfully until 2016. The smoke-filled rooms did it, and then the party elders found other ways to exclude people like, pizza magnates or whatever. Only parties can do that. As James Q. Wilson, the great 20th century political scientist, said, parties assemble power in the form of government, and no structure other than parties can do that. And if there is a way back for America, like it or not, it's going to have to be through figuring out how to repair the Republican Party and bring it back into the Democratic fold.
Final question to Pete Wehner, and thank you both again for a wonderful conversation. Pete, John says that the only way to participate in politics is through political parties, traditional political parties. But on our How to Fix Democracy show, we've been looking at lots of other innovative practices like citizen assemblies for encouraging and enriching political participation. Can we get beyond political parties in America? Should we want to? Or do you agree with John that we're just stuck with what we have and there's not much we can do about it?
Well, I frame it somewhat differently. I mean, I do think we have political parties, and I think John is right. We're not going to be able to fix our political problems outside of the context of political parties. They're going to be necessary instruments of it. But that doesn't mean that the political parties can't get better. They obviously can, because you look throughout history, and some parties have gotten better and worse. And beyond that, an exclusive focus on political parties is not the way to go, national political parties, because I think that Tocquevillian insight, which is part of the reason when you were asking me earlier why I became a Republican, one of them was this notion of sort of federalism and subsidiarity, as Catholics refer to it, which is government operating closest to the people on the ground. That most of our lives are lived in communities, right? So when you talk about the various things, school boards, civic associations, there are 100 manifestations of that. That's mostly where our lives are lived, and they matter a great deal. And if you're able to build those institutions from the ground up, that ultimately manifests itself in our politics. You know, I've said before that sometimes I get a sense when people are talking that they think that, you know, our politics sucks and the public is fine. And in fact, it's not. That's not the way it works. Politics is the stage in which we play out our lives, our own passions, our own interests, and everything else. So ultimately, we have to, as individuals and then as communities, begin to repair our lives, those lives, and then it begins to reform the country at large. One person alone can't change a culture, but a lot of people acting together can change a culture. Andrew Sullivan and Jon Rauch, through their arguments on same-sex marriage, changed culture. When they began to write, that idea was an anathema. No one would have thought you would ever get to the point where you would have it. But they persisted. They made the arguments in a thoughtful and reasonable way. They never got angry or aggressive in it. And over time, things change. So you have to. I have a friend who says that, you know, you can be a theoretical pessimist, but you ought to be an operational optimist. And I think that we should just be operational optimists. And also, as Americans, have some degree of faith that this country has survived harder times than this, and the capacity for American self-renewal is pretty impressive.
Well, on that operationally optimistic note, I want to thank you both for a wonderful conversation. Jon, you said you weren't distinguished. I think you disproved yourself. Thank you both so much, and we'll talk again in the not too distant future. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you.